Thanks, Christian, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. As Christian said, I'm going to be talking about the results of a systematic review that I've been conducting, looking at the barriers and facilitators to colonoscopy. So I thought I would start with some very basic background regarding colonoscopy. So, as I'm sure many of you will already be aware, colonoscopy is widely considered the gold standard test in the investigation of colorectal cancer, and it's recommended by several groups, including the Asia Pacific Colorectal Cancer Working Group, the US Preventive Services Task Force, and the Council of the European Union as well. However, despite being widely recommended, colonoscopy is often underutilized in many different contexts. So, for example, a recent international survey found that on average, only 79% of people who have an abnormal FIT result taking part in a bowel cancer screening program would actually go on to attend colonoscopy. And similarly, for surveillance colonoscopy, there's also suboptimal uptake. So an older study found that for surveillance colonoscopy, participation ranged from sort of 52% to 85% in different parts of America. And of course, not attending or delaying colonoscopy is associated with a number of adverse outcomes, including an increased risk of actually being diagnosed with colorectal cancer, an increased risk of being diagnosed with colorectal cancer at an advanced stage, and an increased risk of dying from colorectal cancer as well. So this would be in comparison to people who participate in colonoscopy sooner rather than later. So there's already been several reviews conducted on this topic of non-attendance at colonoscopy, but many of these have certain limitations. So, for example, some reviews have combined attendance at colonoscopy with attendance at other investigations, such as CT colonography, making it difficult to establish what the barriers to each of these tests specifically might be. And other systematic reviews have really focused exclusively on screening colonoscopy and have ignored perhaps surveillance colonoscopy or diagnostic colonoscopy. And of course, there might be some contextual barriers that are important to consider. So the aim of this review really was to enhance our understanding of the reasons why people do or do not take part in colonoscopy by reviewing and synthesizing qualitative studies from multiple contexts, so surveillance, screening, and diagnosis. In terms of the study design, we used a rapid systematic review and thematic synthesis methodology to assess and synthesize the qualitative literature. And the reason why we decided to do a rapid systematic review as to opposed to a more comprehensive conventional systematic review is that, first of all, the results were needed quite quickly. This study formed the first of 5 studies comprising a 3-year fellowship. And second of all, the resources for a sort of fully comprehensive systematic review were not available to us. So in the first instance, we searched PubMed for qualitative studies that explored barriers and facilitators to colonoscopy. And we used a rapid review methodology that's been previously described in the literature by Duffy and colleagues. And this particular method starts with a narrow search, so where you would use just a small number of search terms, and then gradually expands the search terms. So it adds more and more, until you get to a point where very few eligible papers are being picked up. So just to kind of illustrate this process, I've kind of presented it in this table here. So as you can see, in the first search, we started with the terms colonoscopy, screening, surveillance, follow-up, interviews, focus groups, and barriers or facilitators. And there's 4 components here. So the first is the test itself, which is colonoscopy. The second is the indication for the test, so screening, surveillance, or follow-up. The third refers to the study design, so interviews or focus groups. And the third refers to the fourth refers to the topic of the focus group or interview. So here we're looking at barriers or facilitators. In the second search, what you can see is that we've expanded 3 of those components. So we've added symptoms to the indication component. We've added discussion to the study design component. And we've added participation to the topic component. And we continue to expand the search terms. So new search terms in the third search represented in green. In the fourth, they're represented in red. And in the fifth, they're represented in purple. And we stopped at this fifth search as the number of new papers that we were picking up from the expansion was less than 1%. So we decided at that point that it was not worth continuing to expand the search term, as it was unlikely to bring up any new papers. We did, of course, perform some safety precaution measures. So we also searched PsycInfo for additional papers that weren't available on PubMed using the final search string used in Search 5. We also searched the reference lists of any papers that we decided to include in the review. And we also searched the reference lists of any relevant systematic reviews as well. So in terms of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, we only include articles that were published in peer-reviewed journals and focused on adult populations, so men and women over the age of 18, studies that only used qualitative research design, such as focus groups, and all of the papers had to include at least one reported barrier or facilitator to colonoscopy. So they could focus on other issues surrounding colonoscopy, but there had to be at least one barrier or facilitator discussed. And we excluded studies that focused exclusively on healthcare professionals because we were really interested in kind of getting the barriers and facilitators from the patient's perspectives. We excluded the use of any studies that used electronic health records on the basis that these would have been input by healthcare professionals and might not necessarily reflect the true reasons why patients did or did not go for colonoscopy. And finally, we excluded any studies that were not available in English. So in terms of the data extraction and synthesis, what we did was we went through the text in the results sections of the papers that were selected for inclusion in our review. And we extracted relevant sections using a template in Excel. And just to make sure that this process was accurate, while it was done for all of the papers by one reviewer, a portion was second checked by another reviewer, just to make sure that the first reviewer was consistently extracting relevant text and not missing anything. And then we derived sub-themes, themes, higher order themes through an iterative coding process and through discussion with a third reviewer. And then we also extracted characteristics on the studies, such as the country in which they were conducted and the design that was used, also using an Excel template. So through the various processes, we identified 1,877 potentially eligible papers. After removing duplicates, we had 1,398, which we performed title and abstract review for. We excluded 1,300 based on the title and abstract alone, and we assessed the full text of 98 papers. After applying the inclusion-exclusion criteria, we ended up with 55 papers and excluded 43 for various reasons, such as using electronic health records. So The majority of studies focused on screening colonoscopy. So that would be colonoscopy being offered as a screening test, as opposed to a follow-up test for an abnormal screening result. So 51 of the 55 studies looked at barriers and facilitators to screening colonoscopy. And as you might expect, the majority were conducted in the USA, where colonoscopy is offered as a screening test. And then the majority of studies also used focus group or interview designs. So 47 of the studies used these approaches to collect the data. So just going to talk through our kind of conceptual framework that we developed from our thematic synthesis. So of course, at the very top, we have barriers and facilitators to colonoscopy. But this was divided into 3 higher order themes: social factors, practical factors, and psychological factors. And then each of these higher order themes was made up of 3 themes. So for example, social factors was made up of cultural taboos and perceptions of masculinity, as well as past experiences and experiences of important others, and the power of positive relationships, social networks, and other influences. Practical factors was made up of just 1 theme, which was competing priorities and accessibility issues, while psychological factors was made up of 6 themes, including concerns about the procedure, attitudes towards health, enhanced peace of mind, and several others. And then each of these was made up of many sub-themes. So those that are colored in yellow represent sub-themes that could act as both facilitators and barriers to colonoscopy. Those that are in red represent those that acted as barriers to colonoscopy. And those that are in green represent those that acted as facilitators for colonoscopy. So unfortunately, I don't have time to talk through all of those today, but what I thought I would do is just go through a couple that perhaps related to follow-up for abnormal screening results in particular, given that a lot of the talk seemed to be focused around this today. So a lack of social support was a key barrier that featured in many of the papers, and in particular, this lack of social support inhibited people from attending colonoscopy for several reasons, such as being unable to get to the colonoscopy appointment. So for people who couldn't drive, for example, they were reliant on other people taking them, but also in other ways as well, so providing emotional support, for example. Hearing about other people's experiences of colonoscopy was also important, and that had the potential to act as both a barrier and a facilitator to colonoscopy. So hearing positive stories about colonoscopy experiences was acting as a facilitator, while hearing negative stories about colonoscopy was acting as a barrier. So here you can see one person talked about hearing stories about colonoscopy being described as horror stories. But in addition to hearing other people's experiences, people's own previous experiences with colonoscopy was also important. So if people had a positive experience in the past with colonoscopy, they'd be more likely to attend compared to people who'd had a negative experience in the past with colonoscopy. Competing priorities and accessibility issues was also a key practical barrier for going for colonoscopy. So one person talked about, for example, in one of the studies, how they were unable to attend their colonoscopy appointment because they had other commitments, having to look after grandchildren, for example. And this was something that featured in many studies as well. Concerns about risk was another barrier to colonoscopy. So of course, colonoscopy isn't without its risks, and perforation to many patients is quite scary. And perforation in particular was cited as a reason for not wanting to have a colonoscopy, particularly for those patients that didn't have any symptoms that something was wrong. So they would say, for example, that they were worried that someone could potentially tear their colon. And fear of pain and discomfort, as many of you probably would have guessed, was a key reason for not wanting to have the colonoscopy. And some recent interviews that I've been conducting really kind of highlight how that is a major concern for many patients. Lack of understanding that bowel cancer can be an asymptomatic disease. So often people saying that they didn't want to go for colonoscopy because they didn't feel like they had anything wrong with them. And this was true even when they had abnormal screening results. And quite interestingly, a lot of people came up with their own explanations as to why they had abnormal screening results. So why they might have an abnormal fit. They would attribute it, for example, to hemorrhoids, and then say, well, they don't need a colonoscopy because they know why there's blood in their stool. And then kind of related to this, there was a lot of distrust in the screening result. So where people couldn't attribute the positive result to an existing symptom or condition, they would simply believe that it was a false positive. Having a family history or having symptoms of colorectal cancer were both cited as facilitators, so motivators for people to actually go and have the colonoscopy. I just wanted to kind of quickly summarize because I know I'm just going over my time. So I think what this review has shown is that there's a wide range of social, practical, and psychological barriers and facilitators to colonoscopy. But the majority of these studies to date have been conducted in America, where the screening landscape is quite different from, say, countries in Europe. And so there's really a need to kind of better understand the barriers and facilitators of colonoscopy in other contexts, such as surveillance and as a follow-up test for people with an abnormal fit. So I just wanted to end my talk by acknowledging my collaborators, Dahir, Emily, Katrina, Colin, Professor Stephen Duffy, and Dr. Christian von Wagner, and also Cancer Research UK, who funded the study.
Thank you, Rob. Once again, I wish we could all applaud you. It was a great talk, very interesting, and there are a couple of questions. So I'm going to go straight to them. So firstly, did your systematic review find any differences for those getting their first colonoscopy versus those who were getting a repeat or subsequent colonoscopy?
Yes, there were some differences. I think, and again, I didn't talk about all the different barriers and facilitators, but for people who are having a repeat colonoscopy, one of the really big barriers or concerns that they have is completing the bowel preparation. So they know how bad the bowel preparation can be, how unpleasant it can be, and they're really not in a hurry to have that again. So they tended to quite often describe like the colonoscopy itself as not being that bad, but having to do the bowel prep as actually being like the worst bit. So definitely the bowel prep acted as a barrier, I would say, for those people, which it didn't so much for people who are having it for the first time, because they had no previous experience of what that can be like.
Great. And there's a few questions coming through now. So just taking another one from Leo van Rossum, could the selection of only English papers have biased specifically the social factor, do you think?
Well, while the papers were reported in English, many of the studies, particularly the American studies, were conducted with different minority groups. So there was quite a large number of papers that were conducted with African American populations, and quite a few studies that were conducted with like Latino and South American populations, I believe, as well. So I think if anything, it might be more that some of the social and cultural barriers described in this, identified in this review, are kind of specific to those ethnic groups. And so there's probably very little representation here, for example, of barriers that would be reported from, like, say, South Asian communities, which would obviously be like more important in the UK context, I guess.
Yeah, and on that one, just one more question before we move on. What about religion as a barrier of religious beliefs? Did you get any strong sense? And just in advance, apologies for anyone who's posted and we haven't addressed. We will come back to some of these questions later on. But yeah,
sure,
maybe just briefly on the issue of religion, anything specific?
So I didn't see anything reported in relation to religion so much. But interestingly, kind of since I've been conducting interviews in the UK, there has been like a few religious barriers that have been coming up. So for example, Muslim women not wanting to have a male endoscopist. It is quite a key one. And then with Jehovah's Witnesses, they're quite concerned about the potential need for blood products transfusion if something was to go wrong with the colonoscopy, as they're unable to accept blood products as part of their religion. So I didn't find any reported in the literature, but I have come across quite a few since doing my own research.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you so much again, Rob. And as I said, there are a few questions still outstanding that we'll pick up later in the general discussion.